CityWorks Expo is a collaborative, co-creative, and multidisciplinary idea exchange and festival conference that happens each fall in Roanoke, Virginia. By day, attendees are immersed in thought-provoking presentations, riveting performances, and engaging dialogue. By night, the conference continues with after-hours networking opportunities during street festivals, parties, and musical events. To learn more about Expo, visit cityworksexpo.com. Expo 2014 was made possible by these fine sponsors.
Well, I'm going to start by telling you the first and only time in my life that I can remember crying looking out over a landscape. I was in a boat, water as far as you could see, gray, still, oily, pallid. It was broken every couple of 100 feet by a little hillock that stood there, sort of a stunted dwarf tree just off in the distance, this red soil. And with the gray skies, I almost felt like I was on Mars. At this point, it just felt alien. We were in a little industrial metal dinghy, sort of finding our way through what felt like endless water. And every half a mile or so, we'd see this spectacle. We'd see this sort of 3x3 wooden raft that clearly had just been sort of cobbled together. And there'd be a little kid on it. And he'd jump over the edge, and he'd disappear for what felt like hours. And just as we started getting really worried, we'd see a head sort of bob above water. And most of the times it was sort of a dejected shake of the head. And then we saw a kid come up, and he was so excited. And he yelled, and he called his parents over, and they came over in a canoe. And we observed the parents jump into the water. And they went down, and we sort of slowed our boat. And we saw them start bringing things up. And first it was things that we couldn't really figure out. It looked like jars of grain. It looked like sort of household things. Then a few others joined, and they went down, and they started bringing up beams and timbers. And then they went down, and they started bringing up these small little things that the kids would grab, and they'd start hugging. And they were children's clothes, and they were toys, and they were all of these family personal possessions. And when we see that landscape I described to you, that broad expanse of water suddenly clicked, and I heard a gasp behind me as we realized what was going on. You see, what had happened was those hillocks that I described to you were the tops of mountains. And that red soil that I described to you was the rich soil that these families had built their farms on for 1,000 years. And the things they were bringing up from the bottom of the water, those were the possessions that they'd had to leave behind when they fled their houses at 2, 3, 4 in the morning as they saw the water coming in up to their ankles, up to their knees, up to their hips. And they grabbed their kids, and they grabbed whatever they could find, and they grabbed their cows, and they ran up the mountains. What had happened was the local bureaucrats had decided that it was finally time for the dam to close up and raise the level of the lake. You see, the people down the water stream didn't have enough electricity to run their lights and their TVs and their factories and their irrigation systems. And so without notice, without warning, without even a thought of these people in these villages, they had just flipped the lever, and the water had started coming up, and these people had fled. We kept going in our boat, and we found these people sort of sheltered on these bigger hillocks, the few places they could get to, and they'd been there for almost a week. I was there with a few people that I had pulled together in the US when we had heard of human rights abuses in this incredibly rural part of the world. We armed ourselves with medical kits, with laptops, with a belief in community organizing. We thought we could show up and help, and we had no idea what we were walking into. In that moment, I understood what it means to be totally and absolutely powerless, to have no control whatsoever over your fundamental dignity, over your rights to yourself and your house. And I decided it was going to be my calling in life to do something about that. But that's not the end of the story. So I stayed in touch with these families over years, and I went back and visited them over and over again. Through a combination of advocacy and policy and literally just calling and yelling at people, they had finally been resettled. And the government had resettled them onto industrially polluted land. You know, no water, barely enough money to buy food for their kids. And what should have been another story of refugee camps, of people who had just lost their identity, turned into one of the most amazing success stories I've ever seen. In these villages, these families had come together, families that had had hundreds of years of feuds between them, and they had bonded, and they had said, we're going to work together to create a better world for ourselves. And they knew they couldn't rely on the government, they couldn't rely on the police, they couldn't rely on anybody, and so they started relying on each other. The kids stepped forward and they started making meals for the community, and they'd boil these huge vats of beans and everybody would sit and eat together. The kids started teaching each other school. And that was interesting to me because the things I learned in that school I never learned anywhere else. But the adults, they decided that they were going to start businesses and they were going to learn skills, and so they left their families and they went to the big city and they learned trades and they came back and they started building these little businesses and tiny little sort of craft works. And together, they're now in this sort of new village settled up on a mountainside. There are thousands of people like them who come to them to learn and understand sort of how they built these villages, and together they're doing it. It's a story that started off sad. And if you think about it from a system level, it's fundamentally heartbreaking, right? There's a system that's created to protect our citizens, to build infrastructure for them, and that system failed these people. But instead of trying to do incremental fixes, instead of trying to go to one shelter and then the next, instead of trying to get one job and the next, instead of trying to figure out their next meal the next, they said, wait, we're done with this. We're taking a step back and we're going to start over. That was the most fundamental lesson that I learned. Over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to share with you a couple of stories about things that we're trying to do in Boston, around the world. They're nothing more than little snippets and examples of this idea that sometimes you have to work outside of the system and see what you can build. I'm going to share with you 3 stories. Some of them are boring in that they have to do with big sort of professions that aren't really emotional. One is silly. It has to do with building a restaurant. And one has to do with how we support our most sort of engaged, motivated people. The common thread to all of these is sometimes when you break out of a system, you don't need a lot of resources to do it. You just need a good idea and you need the people to help you. So if you'll join me, I'd like to share some of these stories with you, and I'll go through them, and I hope there's lots of questions as we go, or at the end. So thanks so much. As I came back from this trip and I figured out what I wanted to do with my life, the very first thing I realized was the reason why these folks had been able to create a better world for themselves was because they had figured out that sometimes you need to be able to deploy resources against problems. And it's not just as easy as waiting for money and aid. Sometimes you have to figure out the best way to deploy it. And so I came back with this conviction that the best way I could help was to figure out how the world worked and then maybe move it around a little bit and try to help the people that I cared about the most. It's up on the screen as repurpose private sector best practices for public good. That's a really wordy way of saying, do some intel, figure out what your enemies are doing, and then do it for the people you care about. I decided to become a lawyer. That's not something I say with a lot of pride, because honestly, I think there's too many lawyers in the world, but maybe not the right kind. So I went to law school, and maybe it wasn't the best of all students. I sort of showed up on the first day and realized that I didn't really care about the curriculum. What I cared about was understanding the system. And so I spent 3 years really trying to travel around the world and do human rights work and understand governments and understand private sector funding. I left law school and then I went to a big law firm. And I spent 3,000 hours a year sitting in a room that was about 10 feet by 10 feet, looking at paperwork, trying to figure out how to make rich people more money, trying to figure out how you structured these crazy transactions that at the end of the day probably killed more trees than they actually used to make whatever product they were trying to make. And I left. I left about 3 years in, and it was probably one of those really sort of silly decisions that had been brewing inside of me for 3 years, and then one day I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. So I decided to start a different kind of law firm. And I said, lawyers are incredibly valuable because they get how everything works. But in these big law firms, they spend all this time trying to make something that doesn't really have any social impact. In the meantime, there are nonprofits and development organizations and social entrepreneurs out there who are creating a better world, and they never go to these big law firms billing $1,000 an hour. It doesn't make sense for them to do it, and even if they had the money, they'd probably figure out a better way to spend it. So we built a law firm that said, hey, look, let's leverage the fact that we can do this for the big private sector clients, but let's use the knowledge and resources we learned by doing it to help the kind of people we care about. So Over 5 years, we've built a firm that's now about 30 people. We spend about 60% of our time doing what traditional lawyers do, and the other 40% doing the stuff that is just absolutely crazy and makes my life incredible. Over the years, we've represented everybody from government development organizations that in Africa are trying to create ways to get foreign investors and capital to come in and do development while still honoring the basic cultural sort of integrity of where they are. We've worked in places like Haiti to build an end-to-end solution to domestic violence in tent camps. And what that means is we went in and we said, there are lots of people here who are trying to address the problems with the police force. There are lots of people here who are trying to address the problems with the Ministry of Justice. There are people who are trying to think about how you culturally change the dynamic of reporting. What's not happening is anybody saying, how do we step out of this system and figure out a way for somebody who gets hurt to be able to talk to all of the different people that they need to talk to and get a resolution? Forget about who the right police inspector is or who the right judge is at the Ministry of Justice. Let's put a lens on this that says, here are outside resources. Here's an external legal organization that will help you navigate this entire context. Along the way, we went down, I took down one of my associates who had expected a corporate law firm job. We had a week in Haiti that was wonderful. We got to meet a lot of incredible people and build a solution. And then we came back and he called me on Monday morning and he said, Vilas, I don't think I'm coming into work today. I said, Mike, this isn't the typical corporate law firm job. You can't just take a vacation because we spent a week in Haiti. And he said, no, I'm actually at Beth Israel. They think I might have cholera. I was like, It was a little hard to find associates to go on my second trip, but they came. And together we were able to build something that was pretty incredible. As I said, we're now about 5 years in, and the work that we've done has changed from saying, how do we find the next project where we think we can be helpful, to instead saying, we're lawyers. There are a lot of lawyers in the world. Why is it that big law firms aren't doing this kind of work and building it into their practices? And there's a simple answer. There's economics, right? This doesn't make you a lot of money to go out and try to make the world a better place. There's a harder answer, which is lawyers go to law school often thinking that they want to change the world, and by the time they come out, they think they want to make a lot of money. We've got to figure out a way to change that. And so what we've been doing a lot of is trying to talk about this model we've built down at the nuts and bolts level to the chairman of the top 5 firms in Boston, right? To law firms across the country and saying, hey, this is totally possible. And in fact, it doesn't really change your economics all that much because you can use the same people as they're being trained. You can use the same resources that you have as a firm without really any more marginal cost. And you can take ownership over the fact that even as you make hundreds of millions of dollars, you're also creating a better world. We're 5 years into it, as I said, and I think we are very optimistic about what the next 5 years hold. We're trying to build essentially these incubators inside of law firms all across the country and inside of law schools so that students can see as they go through their educational platform how you can engage in these kinds of projects and how they track right back to the work that you're going to be doing for your paying clients. In this way, we want to take the entire industry of law firms and sort of push them around a little bit and say, you can work outside of the system that you're based in. You just have to take a step back and redesign it. Along the way, so we do all sorts of fun stuff. I think this is us at an Arctic ice bar. The idea is to engage lots of different people in lots of different ways, and our lawyers are very non-traditional. They come from backgrounds that range from building social entrepreneurship to being farmers and agronomists to being tax accountants, right? People who understand sort of all the different aspects of day-to-day life who come together, and we are able to leverage that for our clients and build sort of really cool solutions. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'll tell you, in a little bit of a flip way, one of the great tragedies of my life, which is that I moved to Boston from New York City. I grew up in a family that valued food and culture and sitting down and having a meal together. And I went to Boston, and I found, and this is 2007, it's changed a bit since then, that every single restaurant had pretty much the same menu. There was sort of a steak and a chicken under a brick and a cod, and I don't know what it was, but it was kind of the thing, right? It was that post-90s restaurant scene. There was really no creativity in the restaurant scene. And so I started talking to a bunch of local chefs and line cooks, and we started hanging out and going out for a few beers. And I'd always say the same thing, which is, hey, whenever we hang out, you make awesome food. Why don't you open your own restaurant? And they'd always say the same thing to me, which is in Boston, which is a pretty conservative town. It's kind of the same thing whenever you try to open a restaurant, which is it takes about $500,000, and it takes about 6 months to work through a permitting process. And to me, this was crazy, right? Like, I grew up with my mother cooking for 50 people out of our house, right? They'd come over for dinner, sit down, no problem, we'd have a great meal. And yet, to do that same thing in Boston took $500,000. It took 6 months to build. This was crazy. And so, again, being young and probably a little bit too full of hubris, I started saying to people, why don't you start your own restaurant? They said, we can't do that. And I said, well, I tell you what, I'll do it and show you how you do it. I had no idea what I was talking about. So this is the second principle here, right? Is there's a lot of talk. At some point, you have to understand that if you want to create something big, you have to take the risk of doing it. And you can't try to syndicate that risk. You can't try to find people who will take it on with you, because at the end of the day, if you're going to try to do something that changes the system, it's fundamentally irrational that you're going to do it, which means you need to own it. So I said I'd open a restaurant. 4 weeks later, I opened a creperie in downtown Boston. We found a storefront right in the middle of the city. And for those of you who've been in Boston, you kind of know downtown. It's a heavy concrete, sort of 1960s architecture, kind of depressing landscape. We found the most depressing storefront. It was a giant concrete slab over a couple of pieces of glass. And in there, we opened up Doré Creperie. We went in 4 weeks later. I brought in just a bunch of friends, a bunch of people from the community. We stripped the place. We put in new equipment. We painted. I talked to City Hall, and they were actually very helpful. It wasn't that permitting took 6 months. It was that permitting the standard way took 6 months. But when you could provide them a reason to be supportive and helpful, when you talked about how this was a social good, how we'd reframe downtown and bring to the table kids from all across the city to work in this restaurant, all of a sudden, local government went from being a barrier to being a huge supporter for us. We got our permits in 4 weeks. We got our place together. We said we'd open on the day of the Bruins parade. They had just won the Stanley Cup. Now, unfortunately, 4 a.m. the day before the Bruins parade, I was in the kitchen trying to figure out how you make crepes. We got it. The first 100 were a little iffy. We got it. We ended up hiring kids from all across the city who had never worked in a restaurant or sometimes never even worked before. We found people that were absolutely phenomenal and were later in life who had had developmental challenges or for whatever reason weren't in the workforce, and we brought them all in to become a part of this team. I heard a general manager who had never worked in a restaurant before. This is not the right way to do it, by the way, folks. I'm just telling you how we did it. And 4 weeks later, we opened. The first day, we served free crepes to the community for 3 hours. We gave away something like 1,500 crepes. We had black and gold crepes, Nutella and banana. It was pretty wonderful. We kept it open for 6 months. And in those 6 months, we brought in 2 classes of employees and trained them. And then we placed every single one of them in a restaurant around the city. We went through about 40 pounds of butter a week. We went through about twice as much Nutella. This was not by any means a healthy play. But along the way, along with the 10 pounds I gained, we got 4.5 stars on Yelp. We had lines out the door. And more than anything else, this little decrepit storefront in the middle of downtown Boston turned into the place where kids from Roxbury came and hung out after school for an hour and had a crepe and some lemonade. And kids from Cambridge came downtown and hung out. Some of the office workers would come over in the afternoon for a snack. People from City Hall would come over just to see what was happening. And this random little crepe restaurant went from serving food to whoever walked by to becoming the gathering place in downtown Boston for the 6 months we were there. We started teaching crepe classes. And so at night, in a row of blacked out storefronts, Doré Creperie would be open with floodlights up on the sign, and we'd have people coming through and learning to cook and learning to mingle. We got people from all across the city. We offered scholarships for these classes, so we got people from all different walks of life. And these dinners would, every single time, we're supposed to stop at 8, and they'd go till midnight. And it was absolutely fantastic. None of this would have happened if I had said we were just going to do it the standard way and sort of work through the permitting process. But like I said, sometimes when we stepped out of the system, unexpected people came out of the woodwork to help us. I talked about City Hall. We had kids that came in and said, hey, I have no idea what a crepe is. And unfortunately, this led to a lot of bad jokes about crepes and crepes and crap and all that other stuff. But along the way, these kids also brought to us an understanding of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and stuff that we weren't even doing, where kids in high school started running our social media presence. And all of a sudden, we had more followers than any restaurant in town, right? All of our kids were making good money. Some of them put money aside for college, everything else. And none of this was in our plan when we started. At the end of the day, we built something that was totally different and unexpected, and it was amazing. I'm going to switch gears one more time, and I'm going to tell you about one more thing. As we were getting fat on crepes and pretending to be lawyers all around the world, we started engaging with a lot of different people that wanted to create change in the same ways that these examples were doing it. And a lot of them were creating nonprofits. And one of the things about nonprofits is if you start a nonprofit, for some reason you're put into a different bucket from the person who starts a tech company, right? Or a business of any sort. We have incubators, we have collaborative workspaces, we have investment funds, we have mentors, we have all of these things for entrepreneurs. But if you're incredibly passionate about a certain change you want to see in the world and you want to do it through a nonprofit, well, I'll actually let them tell you. Can we play that video?
Before I moved into the Next Mile project, I was working from home at my kitchen table.
Out of my parents' house.
In my kitchen, at my parents' house.
Around my dorm room in college.
At one shared table,
Anywhere that would basically take me.
One of the challenges of starting a nonprofit and working out of your home is that you have no community
To look towards in terms of when we had some of these initial questions.
Having human contact is a good thing.
And so I think we definitely knew that we wanted to find a space that would really allow for good, meaningful collaboration.
We want the Next Mile project to serve as a foundational baseline for how nonprofits interact. Not just here in Boston, Massachusetts, or in New York or San Francisco, but across the entire country and hopefully across the entire world. As we have this platform for growth, one of the things that we've tried to do is to build a virtual learning community, a way to extend the impact of the Next Mile project, not just in Boston, but nationally, by providing resources where nonprofits from around the country can come together to seek solutions to their usual problems.
We've learned everything from the Next Mile project.
we get to share ideas and kind of collaborate on projects with a community of
Amazing people that are doing really, really wonderful work all around the world.
You can really count on other people to support you.
There are a range of collaborations, big and small, that happen on a regular basis.
Every time I have a question,
able to go to anyone in this space, different offices, working in different countries, and share ideas.
Actually building formal partnerships.
Just having their input and finding the best people for those roles is helpful.
It's also nice to have a space where you can sort of settle in and organize all of your things. And
donors come in, check out what you're doing, you can have board meetings in person.
And so to have to be able to carve out chunks of time, a couple days a week.
You know, the funny thing is, we don't really think of the Next Mile project as a revolutionary idea. In fact, it's the kind of thing that we look at and we say, why haven't we been doing this all along?
Thank you. Thanks. So to frame that, what we saw was all of these people who wanted to create a better world, and every single one of them felt alone. They felt like they weren't supported. They felt like nobody actually cared about what they were doing. And so they were out there doing work all across the world, in Africa and Southeast Asia, in Boston, and they felt like they were doing it by themselves. So we took a look at that and we said, we've helped every one of these organizations one-on-one for the last 5 years. But everything we've done is not something that we were particularly better at. It's just that we were the resource that they came to. So we built what you've seen there, which was the first iteration of the Next Mile project. It's an incubator for nonprofits where we connect them not to us or to outside sources, but to each other. Then on top of that, we layer outside support we layer sort of knowledge and learning, and now we're building a technology platform that connects nonprofits pretty much across the entire country. And we're really excited for what that's going to build. This last week, we had, it turns out, 2 of the organizations that are doing the most effective work on Ebola in Liberia are working out of our space. And when people got kicked out of Liberia and Sierra Leone because of the quarantine, they all came back to Boston. And on Tuesday, we launched, in partnership with Partners in Health, the first concerted nonprofit collaborative effort in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Thank you so much. I'm going to close with just a couple of additional thoughts. The first is make peace with the success curve. And what does that mean? It means that when you set out to do any of these things, you don't really know where you're going to end up. And if you're always anxious about it as you go, it turns out that you stop paying attention to what you can really build. With each of these experiments that I've told you about, we had no idea where we were going when we started, other than the conviction that we knew we could create something really cool. Some of it became apparent really fast. 4 weeks into saying I was going to start a restaurant, we were serving crepes out to the neighborhood. The Next Mile project we've been working on for 2.5 years, and every day is sort of a new adventure, and we're building something new within it. This is probably the most important thing, and I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes talking about this. I'm very lucky to have come to Roanoke twice so far. I came once over the summer to visit Julia and to meet a lot of you. And again, I've been here a couple of days on this trip. It's incredible to me that I've spent about 70 or 75 hours in this town, and I've already met 15 or 16 people, each of whom are running an incredible business, building some sort of adventure, or creating a platform to support others. I'm inspired to be here, right? And so when I share with you the stories that I have, the only reason I do that is because hopefully there's something that I can help you by sharing those stories with you. I think it's really important to share successes and failures. And one of these sort of really contemporary things that's meaningful to me is in the tech world, there's a guy named Elon Musk. He created all sorts of fun things, including Tesla. And he very recently came out and made what really didn't get very much press, but it's kind of a really meaningful statement. He said, all of the technology that we've developed at this company and we have patents on, we're going to share freely and openly with anybody who wants to develop off of them. Now, this is something that in the corporate world is billions of dollars of value that's just being given away. But it's also something that means that entrepreneurs in small towns across the country can start building technology that fits across a platform that's going to be national. I believe very strongly in building platforms. I think it's great that there is something like Expo here, that there's something like the Next Mile project, that there are ways for people to connect their businesses into what their communities are doing and to grow together. I'm going to end by saying one thing, which is I have been so happy to come here that what I would love to do is in a year to come back on this stage and share a project that I've done with somebody in this room or that we built together. I promise I don't really have very many hard skills, but I'm great with a shovel and great behind a crepe maker and anything else that I can help with. But that's my ask to you as well, is let's do something really amazing that changes the system. Thank you so much for listening to all of these. I'm happy to answer any questions.